I think we're about ready in between one vote and another to welcome our keynote speaker for the morning, Congressman Adam Smith, who, if you've been around Washington state politics at all, particularly in Democratic politics, but not just Democratic politics, you've gotten to know or you've had a chance to hear from Congressman Smith ever since day one. I just can't really say enough good stuff about Congressman Smith because he's just kind, he's super smart, he's gracious, and I'm sure maybe there are some generals in the military that might think differently, but every interaction I've had with him has always been top of class. So with that, Congressman Smith, I know you're in between votes. Thank you very much for making time to be with us, sir.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it, DJ. It's good to see you. Appreciate the chance as always. And fortunately, votes now are like 35, 40 minutes apart because they try to sequence us over there because of COVID. So we got a little bit more time, a little bit more flexibility. But I really appreciate your efforts and the work in the state on the overall legislative process. And this is, a very interesting time to be involved in politics and public policy. So I really appreciate the chance to speak with you and hopefully answer some questions and get into a discussion about it, because I think this, we have a number of challenges, obviously. The biggest crises of my political career and probably of my lifetime as we deal with the pandemic and the crushing economic fallout of it, and then the huge equity and social justice crisis that we have spreading across the country as well. And to deal with all of those challenges, we need a robust political response. We need our political leaders to find a way to work together, to come up with solutions and move forward precisely at a time when a whole bunch of different forces are making that more difficult. It's just not the orientation. And the simplest way I look at it is when people think of politics, the average people, have an instantaneous negative reaction to the word itself. Politics is to be avoided. We need to handle this, but we got to keep politics out of it. That's sort of the general gist. I think people think of politics as partisanship, people playing games, trying to get advantage over one person or another, one party trying to defeat the other, circumventing the system, chasing after money, not focused on policy. To me, politics is a much, much, much different thing. And it's why I got involved in the first place back when I was a kid growing up in SeaTac and started, going to Democratic Party meetings. Politics to me is about bringing people together to try and solve problems. You bring diverse groups of people together who have different opinions, different wants, different desires, but somehow they got to work together. They got to figure out, okay, we're not going to be able to force one side or the other to do everything we want. So how do we listen to each other, work together to come up with solutions? And that's what we need to do right now. Sadly, partisanship and personalities have taken over and made that more difficult. But the problems could not be more urgent. And I still believe this can work, that we can work together and find those solutions. But to do that, we really need to start, listening to each other. There is as deep a partisan divide in this country as there has ever been. Frankly, the only other comparison is right before the Civil War. And that is not an encouraging comparison. So what I think we really need to do is to try to find ways to, whether you're a Trump supporter or not a Trump supporter, let's talk to each other. And let's try to focus on the problems that we face and the solutions of those and the policies that we need to implement to get that done. Right now back in Congress, we're wrestling with coming up with a COVID relief package, which is desperately needed. I mean, there's just no other way around it. The poverty rates, the number of people who are food insecure, the number of people who are unable to pay their rent or pay their mortgage, the number of businesses that are facing bankruptcy is at levels we have not seen since the Great Depression. We need help, and we need to come together on that policy. But going forward, aside from just the basic politics of how we pull people together, I think that the policy priorities heading in to President Biden's tenure into the next Congress and the next legislative sessions, income inequality is a crushing problem in our society. The fact that so much of the wealth and the increase in prosperity that has happened over the course of the last 50 years has become more and more concentrated in the very top. Is a huge challenge. And we've seen it in terms of the basic costs of a blue collar middle class life going up while the wages have not matched that. And I think of my own upbringing in terms of what made it possible. The cost of a house. My father bought a house in SeaTac in 1971 for $15,000. Flipping through the paper now, they actually have houses in SeaTac going for $1 billion. I mean, it just blows my mind. Okay, it is so much more expensive to live anywhere within a 50-mile radius of Seattle, which is that 50-mile radius is also where the jobs are. So that is crushing. And then education. When I tell people, what I paid $3,000 a year for a law school degree at the University of Washington. All right. Even, I went to Fordham University. I got grants and loans and some help, and I worked at UPS to try to make, but tuition at Fordham then was $6,500. Okay. And I'm not that old. I mean, I'm older than I'd like to be, of course, but it's not that long ago. Now that, my daughter, she went to the University of Washington for economic reasons, but she applied and got into Fordham, and it's $70,000 a year. All right. These are the economic realities that are facing families. Meanwhile, the wages just haven't kept up. And I haven't done this yet, but it's something that I really want to go back and do. Is my father, last year he worked, he made $16 an hour as a ramp serviceman, baggage handler at United Airlines. I'd love to go back and see, okay, what was the CEO of United Airlines making in 1985, the top executives, and then fast forward to see what that CEO pay is versus what that ramp serviceman is making now. And I guarantee you, it's, the divide is overwhelming. And that has put a huge burden on people to try to live what the American dream. The American dream is, work hard, play by the rules. You can raise your family and have a decent standard of living. Maybe send your kids to college. And that is just, choking us off. So I think a lot of our policy focuses have to be on what can we do to make education more affordable. I mean, part of it is recognizing that a 4-year degree is not the magical thing that we all thought it was, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. There are a lot of good apprenticeship programs, good training programs that are much cheaper, and you can walk out of there making a lot more money than getting a sociology degree from, I don't know, Swarthmore or whatever. How do we readjust that and really help the middle class get a fair shot? I think those issues, and the cost of healthcare, that's the other thing that has gone through the ceiling in the last 30 or 40 years. How do we get those? How do we really rework that middle class American dream? Has to be at the center of our politics and policies on both the state and the federal level. So, I could go on about a lot of different topics. Congress right now, like I said, we're trying to pass the appropriations bill. We're trying to pass the COVID relief package. We're also trying to pass my bill, and it literally is my bill this year, the defense bill, which is the defense policy bill. That is the one bill that passes every year, which we passed out of the House a couple of days ago. 335 votes, and the president says he's going to veto it for a reason that it's really hard to explain. It's utterly and completely bizarre. But if he does veto it, then we got to override him and all that. So that's what we're trying to do back here. But more than anything, like I said, I'm trying to help my community pull people together, figure out how can we work, business and government, work together, figure out how we can have solutions. I don't think it's helpful to have extremist ideology, saying businesses are evil or government is evil. No, we're trying to work together and figure out what's best for the community. And that's what I'm trying to figure out.
You said something here at the beginning of your comments, which I don't want to say it rattled me a little bit, but I definitely caught it, which I'll preface by saying you're a level-headed guy and you've always been even keeled on any range of issues. But you said something to the effect of that you still think this can work. And I thought you were talking about the American Republic. Is that right?
I was.
Yeah. Are we, I think we are a little bit insulated back here, as you know, in the Northwest. We're so far away from Washington, D.C. There are some folks that are, look at data and will point to the polarization that you cited being as bad now as it has ever been, except for 1861, in the start of the Civil War. How do you as an individual but with an important position in Congress. How do you, as any one individual, try to help change the way we work together, we talk with each other? Is it doable as an individual? Is it doable to change the way our politics works as a member of Congress or as a Congress, or does it take something else?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's totally doable. I mean, one person can always make a difference, and it's part of moving the broader effort forward. And I want to be clear about what I'm talking about. Democracy itself, the very idea of it, hasn't really been around that long. And if you look at polls and if you look at people's estimations of it right now, this is the lowest support we've had for democracy, just the basic concept of democratic governance, since the end of World War II. People have become very skeptical about it. And you've seen the rise of more authoritarian-like regimes in Turkey, in the Philippines, in parts of Eastern Europe. You've seen that approach that moves away from the idea of representative democracy. And I think what an individual can do is, first of all, before I get to the individual, the core argument that we have to make is to understand, well, why? I think part of the problem is we all grew up thinking democracy is a good thing. Democracy is a good thing, like breathing is a good thing. You don't think about it, you just do it. Obviously it's the best way to do it because it's what we all grew up with. And we sort of stopped thinking about why, and now that people are challenging it, I think sometimes people struggle to explain it. But why is this? Representative government is a good thing because it is inclusive. Like, the best way of thinking about this is something that Dick Gephardt used to say, and that is that politics is a substitute for violence. And at the time he said that, I thought, well, that's a little harsh. But the point is, we have to resolve our differences in any situation. If you're in a family, the four of you got to figure out what you're having for dinner. If you live in a homeowners association, God help you, first of all. But second of all, you have to resolve your differences. What color can the houses be? Where do you park? How are we going to, we have to find a way to resolve our differences. So what are our choices in doing that? Well, throughout much of human history, basically, whoever was strong enough to crush the opposition made the choices and you lived with them, period. Okay. Violence solved the issue. All right. But we came up with a better system because inevitably it's war upon war upon war, and you wind up killing each other, and nobody wants to live that way. So what's a better solution? So first of all, democracy, representative government is much preferable to violence in and of itself. But second of all, it leads to a better society because you hear from everybody. Now, I like to think of myself as a reasonably intelligent guy. I have my good days and my bad days, but I can tell you every single day I am wrong. Every single day I have a thought of it. But if you've got people around you who you work with, whose opinions you bring in, you will hear different perspectives. You will hear things that you hadn't thought of, and you will come up with better solutions to problems. And also, you will have more buy-in with those solutions. If you are part of the discussion, if you're part of the conversation and your needs were taken into account, you're more likely to be supportive of it than if somebody came down and said, no, you got to do this.
Yeah.
So it's stability that you bring in. And I think you make that argument. And then as one individual, you can do it. Rather than when someone disagrees with you saying, you're an idiot, shut up, listen and show that there is a better way to have that conversation.
So I think this is an important conversation, and I think it's important for our folks who are mostly pretty Olympia-centric, just to appreciate the role that you play as the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. This is the chair of the primary oversight committee in the House for all of our military. And you mentioned Turkey. Turkey's a place where the military has been actively engaged in pressuring the civilian authorities there, and in some cases overthrowing civilian authorities there. This week, President-elect Biden announced that he wanted to appoint Lloyd Austin, a former general, to be the head of the Department of Defense. Generals are not allowed, unless they have a waiver, to serve as the Secretary of Defense. What are your thoughts on whether we should have a general lead a former general lead the Department of Defense, and how important is it right now to have civilian control over the military?
Yeah, a quick point on the Armed Services Committee. So as the chair of the committee, we pass the National Defense Authorizing Act every year. It's a 3,000 page bill. You allocate $740 billion in spending. it is the only bill in Congress that every year now goes through the typical process, how a bill becomes a law, schoolhouse rock, House, committee, House, and it's a really important process. And that gets to my democracy point. We ought to have more bills like that. Our bill, it's the only conference report we pass every year. So it's good to be able to be in there. And that's what we do. We listen to all the members of the House, all the members of the Senate. We come up with ideas. We put together a bill. We get it done. And we pass good policy. It's the way it's supposed to work. I am very concerned about making sure that we maintain civilian control of the military. Now the civilian control of the military is more than just making sure that the Secretary of Defense is a civilian, not a military officer. There are all kinds of things that are built into that, beginning with the fact that the president in January 20th, it will be Joe Biden, despite what you may be seeing in some quarters. He did win rather overwhelmingly, as a matter of fact. He's a civilian and he is the commander in chief. He is in charge. So there are other protections for it. Now, the law was passed that said you have to be out of the military for 7 years to be Secretary of Defense. General Austin has been out for 4, so he needs a waiver. Congress needs to waive that requirement. And I think it's a very serious issue. I like General Austin. I've worked with him in a number of different capacities. He's an incredibly capable person. But I want to hear from him. I want to hear his explanation of why civilian control of the military is important and how he intends to make sure that it is preserved despite his career as a general officer. So, we're going to have that conversation, and then we'll see. I have not yet decided on whether or not I would support the waiver.
Dan McGrady asks if you might point us to or illuminate a couple of pivots in terms of Joe Biden's foreign policy and how it will differ substantively in your view. Maybe you have some thoughts on China or trade or defense policy in general.
Well, I think the biggest difference is, how to explain, is to think about what Donald Trump's foreign policy was. And he actually did have a pretty specific foreign policy that was based on 3 core principles. Number one, he is distrustful of alliances. I mean, he'll tell you, I've sat and heard him talk about how America is based, we're suckers. Okay. We're doing all these things for all these other countries, working with other countries. We get the short end of the stick. So he was distrustful of alliances in general. Number 2, he wants to pull America back from the world. He doesn't think that us, which is kind of similar to the first one, the notion that our engagement in the world, we've given more than we've gotten. And number 3, he has a fondness for autocrats and a distrust of democracy. And we've seen that in, my gosh, he found ways to think of Kim Jong-un as a lovely person. At the same time, he can't get along with Angela Merkel. So there was a definite bent of Trumpian foreign policy, which was anti-alliance, anti-US involvement, pro-autocrat. And Joe Biden's going to do the exact opposite of all 3 of those things. He believes the alliances will further strengthen us, pull us forward as a country. He believes the US should be engaged and involved in the world, and that we should, to the extent possible, try to promote democracy and human rights. Now, you got to work with who you got to work with. And if you believe in alliances, then that can occasionally conflict with the belief in working with democracies, because like in the Middle East, Israel's a democracy, Iraq is, a democracy, kind of getting there. But by and large, you don't have democracies to work with. Does that mean that you don't work with anybody? No, you're going to have to balance that. But the biggest change is that, Biden is going to focus on engaging, building alliances. Also, you are going to see a greater emphasis on development and diplomacy and less of an emphasis on using the military as the defining element of our foreign presence. I apologize for that. Those are the bells on the background there. So it's going to be more about engagement and less about belligerence, more about cooperation and less about jamming our ideas down everybody else's throat. And that's a huge shift. In the first 6 months, turning that around is going to take a little time, because that's a big change in our fundamental foreign policy approach.
For our attendees, you'll note that there are questions stacking up in the box here on the right, and you can upvote those. I'll take your upvoting as prioritization. So even if you don't have a particular question, but you want a question asked, go ahead and upvote those. And then as I ask them or as they are being addressed, I'm moving them into the answered column so that if they disappear, they haven't gone away forever. Congressman Anthony Hempstead asks about your assessment on the likelihood or timing of an infrastructure bill in particular, but also stimulus in general. Do you think that's likely to happen, infrastructure in Q1, or is that best case scenario maybe later in 2021?
Well, I think President-elect Biden's going to have some clear priorities up front. Number one is going to be the pandemic. And that involves both, finally getting a clear set of instructions as to how we can best protect ourselves from that and get the vaccine distributed. It's been a great disappointment to me the last year that we have not used the full force and power of the federal government to manufacture and distribute the equipment that we need to deal with the pandemic. We just haven't done it. Jared Kushner, who I've worked with on a variety of things, he believes in the private sector. He didn't see the Defense Production Act and all this other stuff as that valuable a tool. So Biden's going to really focus on that. Second, economic relief. There will be a major push for a major economic relief package. Now, McConnell is still in charge of the Senate. So where does that go? I don't know. And I think the other priority in there is going to be updating the ACA. I would say that infrastructure is probably fourth after those first three. And I think it's something that he will probably propose, might be Q2 instead of Q1, but then it's going to take a while. And look, the two major impediments to an infrastructure package are, number one, the politics that I talked about. I mean, it's just really hard to get things done anymore because people don't want to get things done. They don't want to compromise. They don't want to cooperate. They don't want to work together. It's too much Ayn Rand, basically, and not enough cooperation. The second major impediment to it is, well, the money. And we need more revenue for infrastructure. The gas tax, given the fact that we are seeing more and more alternative fuel cars, there's a solution. The state of Washington, by the way, the state of Washington's done a really good job on developing alternative sources of revenue. I know not as good a job as some would like, but compared to the federal government, it's off the charts in terms of coming up with new ways to raise revenue in light of the fact that the gas tax isn't doing it anymore. The federal government hasn't got there. We need new sources of revenue to fund that infrastructure package. And there's a ton of ideas out there, but we got to take one. This is something that Republicans and Democrats used to be able to agree about, is infrastructure. That's the impediment. But it's so crucial. I mean, you drive anywhere in this country, you go anywhere in an airport, the infrastructure needs are overwhelming.
Yeah. Brian Benzel asks, building on what you've just sort of spoken to in your previous comments about what specific actions can the two parties take to help get Congress working again and American politics working again? And I'll add a little clarification. These are my words, not his, but what should Republican grassroots folks who want to see government work ask of their Republican Party leaders and elected officials? And what should Democrats be asking of their Democratic Party leaders and elected officials if they believe that we need to be working together better to make this work?
I think the key up front is to reject extremism. Reject extremism on both sides. Do not be afraid to speak out when your party does something that is extremist and stupid. Because that is what you've got, the people on the edges. And every society ever has always had the people who are convinced that they have the 3-point plan that they have to jam down everybody's throat in order to make the world work, or they're just pushing their own self-interest. But then they get so powerful that even the people who don't agree with them don't say anything. Like, well, I know that's crazy, but I want them coming after me. And I'll give you specific examples here, and I may get myself in trouble depending on who's listening to this call, but I think it's too important to keep dancing around the edges here. Okay. Trump he's not actually a Republican. He is an incredibly accomplished con man. All right. And you got to tip the hat to the guy. I mean, if it would have worked for him to be a Democrat, he would have been a Democrat. It just turns out that being anti-immigration, kind of sells. There were a few things in there that just worked with the Republican Party. So he took over. I mean, this whole election thing, it is insane. He lost. Okay. They cannot produce a single bit of evidence of any widespread fraud in any state. And yet they're convincing everybody that it was stolen. There's nothing to it other than Trump's own ego and just decide to do it. You have to speak out against that stuff. And on the Democratic side, we see it in Seattle. I mean, I think Shauna Swan is the example of the opposite side of this. And that level of crazy extremism that we're hearing coming out of Seattle, and what's happening to Seattle is beyond sad. As Democrats, we need to stand up and say, no, we don't agree with those policies. We don't agree with eliminating the police. We don't. I don't support socialism. I'm a Democrat. I'm not a socialist. I don't think corporations are evil. They do bad things. They do good things. The corporations are part of society to be worked with and controlled and regulated where appropriate. So speak out. And that's the problem. I've often described myself as a radical pragmatist. And I mean that. I am incredibly passionate about pragmatism. Most of the time people think that, well, if you're not an extreme socialist or an extreme conservative or whatever, then you just don't really care. If anyone spent any time around me, I care passionately. All right. I want the best solution. You got to speak out for it. You can't be cowed by others in the party and in the crowd. And look, one just quick point on this, where the Republican Party totally lost its way was when Mark Sanford lost. And you may not even know who Mark Sanford is, but he was a member of Congress. I served with him. Then he became governor of South Carolina. Then he had a rather famous affair with a woman from Argentina that drove him out of his governorship. Hiking in the Appalachian Trail will never mean the same thing again as a result of that. But then he got elected to Congress, which I find fascinating for reasons I'll get to in a second. And I like Mark. I've worked with him for a long time. He was one of the few Republicans after 2016 that when Trump said things that were wrong, terrible, offensive, he said, yeah, that's wrong, terrible, offensive. So they targeted him in a primary and they beat him. Okay. And he lost. And every Republican saw that and said, I can't take him on. And I just want to close by saying, think about this. So the Republican voters of South Carolina said, okay, you're a strong Christian family values guy. You have an affair, blow up your family. That's fine. We'll send you back to Congress. But, you said something bad about Trump? You're out. Okay. That's when things really went south. So you got to stand up for your principles. And if your principles are pragmatism and getting things done instead of extremism, then damn it, say it and fight for it.
You were gracious and you've pretty much maybe said yes to every favor I've ever asked you, which I appreciate. You were gracious back in 2001. We had a meeting where we sat down and I picked your brain about some things. And you said, youth and ambition must be served. And you're less young now than you were then. Gosh, you're a chairman. You're one of those sort of lions now in the caucus, so to speak. Do you still think youth and ambition must be served, or has your thoughts changed as you've wizened a little bit over the years?
No, absolutely. I was like the corollary to that, which is, old age and treachery will always beat youth and ambition. So I'm becoming more fond of that aspect of the saying. But no, I in my role now as chairman, in fact, the call I had before this one was an argument about a decision I want to make on the committee to more empower the members further down the dais, freshmen and new members. And unsurprisingly, the senior members and subcommittee chairs are, a little bit reluctant to embrace that idea. No, I think, you've got, I don't know how to put this exactly. Egotism is a very dangerous thing. And, like I said, no one is ever going to accuse me of lacking in confidence. But I'm also acutely aware of my limitations and of the fact that there's a lot of smart, capable people in the world. I'm not the only one. We need to empower other people. We need to bring them in, okay, and not view this in such a self-centered way. I mean, I have a number of different ideas about where everything went south, but one of them is, 50 years ago, Milton Friedman wrote the column that said, corporations have no obligation to the community. Their job is to make money, period, full stop. If they are making money, they are fulfilling the capitalist idea of survival of the fittest, and that is the best thing they can do. He was totally wrong. Okay. And if you tell people that being selfish isn't just being selfish, but it is the height of ethical behavior, all right, that, what's best for me is what's best for everybody. I have 2 teenage children, and I think of this in the context of being a parent. And you'll see parents do things that seem unbelievably selfish, and they'll say, I have to do what's best for my kids. And I'm like, no, you don't. If you think what's best for your kids is to tell your kids that they're more important than anybody else on the planet, and no matter who you step on and no matter how you cheat in order to, quote, protect your kids, that's what you think is the best way to be a parent, you can tell I don't think much of that approach. Okay. If my kid mouths off in class and the teacher, I'm not going to go to the teacher and say, how dare you say that to my child? I'm going to go to my son and say, that's what happens. All right. I hope you figure out how to deal with it. So this whole idea, me, that ain't no way to run a society, in my humble opinion. And again, I say this as, at 23 years old, I decided that I could be a state senator. All right. It was 2 years later that I got elected. It was a long campaign. So it's not that I don't see the value of individual ambition, but it's not everything. That balance has been lost in our society, in my not so humble opinion.
Well, we're going to have you back and do this again, maybe later in 2021, and check in and just see how things are going. This has been a great conversation. You've crossed a lot of the waterfront, so to speak. I want to ask you this one last question, which is, given all of this and given the context of a brutal 2020, when you look ahead into 2021 and you look just ahead in general, whether it's politics or government or your personal life and the community, what gives you hope right now as you look ahead to 2021?
Well, what gives me hope is the people that I interact with, and also sort of where we're at in human history. So I'll say 2 things. I always get hope, and I haven't been able to do this recently, obviously, when I go visit schools. And, whether it doesn't matter if it's a 3rd grade class or a high school class or whatever, and we just have a conversation. And I meet all these kids that talk about what they're going to want to do, where they're going to go, and the talent that we have in this society is just unbelievable. And the ability that people have to go out there and solve problems is incredible. The second thing gives me hope is, from a technology standpoint, we've never been better positioned to confront the challenges we face, whether it's climate change, income inequality, a pandemic. We have so many incredibly smart people and so many technological advances. I am convinced that if we put those tools together, we can solve just about any problem facing us. And that gives me hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is, I never expect things to go well all the time. It's just sort of my orientation. Had a reasonably rough upbringing as a child, and I was never under the illusion that everything was going to be fine. It's kind of a balance. And, and you work your way through that balance, and you grow and you learn from those experiences. So the other thing that gives me hope is, we have come through worse things. As bad as this may seem, we have come through worse things. We have a very strong society. Like I said, we have incredibly talented people, great technology. I'm convinced that we can meet the challenges that we face. So, not going to be easy, but I was like, say, if it wasn't easy, what fun would it be? That's one of my quotes. And every once in a while, I'm like, yeah, now that I think about it, it probably would still be fun if it was easy. It doesn't have to be this hard. But I know we can meet tough challenges.
Congressman Adam Smith from Washington's 9th Congressional District and Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Sir, thanks for making time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, DJ. Great to see you.